Thank you, Chief, and I want to thank the City of Richfield for bringing me out to present to the community. We do a lot of work with data analysis, and we write a lot of reports, and we build a lot of dashboards, but it's really enjoyable for me to be able to present this information to the police department and to elected officials and to the community and get feedback. And our main goal tonight is to give you as much data and information as we can, and to try as best we can to explain that data and information. But what I'm not going to be doing is telling you exactly what this means. Because although there is a lot of data to present, there is only so far you can go with a quantitative data analysis. So I will not be able to tell you tonight whether there is racial profiling or bias policing going on in the Richfield Police Department. It's possible there is, it's possible there isn't. I wouldn't be able to tell you what level or degree of racial profiling or bias policing is going on. That's just not possible with the quantitative data. However, there are people that will say, this shows that there's racial profiling, or this shows that there's not racial profiling. There's no way you can make those definitive determinations from the quantitative data alone. Having said that, there's a lot that you can learn from the data. And the goal is to help the community and elected officials understand the data so that then you can focus on the areas that are of most concern and develop data-driven strategies and evidence-based best practices to address those concerns that you have. So to get started, just a little bit about our company. So I'll talk about myself in a moment. We have 4 principal partners. Mike Sanford is a former assistant chief at Seattle PD, and he's also the chief of police at a couple of other smaller agencies in Washington State. Catherine Olson is one of the partners. She is the former civilian director of the Office of Professional Accountability, which is the civilian oversight of Seattle PD. We have a number of partnerships with universities across the country. Our main partnership is with the Seattle University and their Criminal Justice Department, and Professor Matt Hickman is the chair of that department. A little bit about me. So I'm an attorney. I was a prosecutor in King County, Washington in the 1990s. I was also a special assistant United States attorney for the Western District of Washington. And I worked on a number of projects, and even though I'm an attorney and worked a lot in government, I've always tried to incorporate data into whatever I do. Because government provides a lot of services, a lot of work for the community, and it's really important to have the data to know what's effective, what works, what doesn't work, how to improve things. And so I've worked on several projects in the prosecutor's office with vertical prosecution programs and armed career criminal prosecution programs, and incorporated data to determine whether those programs were effective or not. For a number of years, I worked as a public safety policy advisor for several mayors in Seattle, worked on virtually every public safety issue there is, and again, incorporating data into homelessness. Where are our homeless encampments? What kind of individuals are in those encampments? How can we provide housing and services to these individuals? All of that is driven by data. I was in the Seattle City Attorney's Office in 2011 when the Department of Justice came in and did a pattern of practice investigation of the Seattle Police Department. They're currently conducting a pattern of practice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department. So I was in the city attorney's office, and I represented the city during that investigation, and that subsequently led to a consent decree that the department is still under, and the mayor appointed me to be the compliance coordinator to oversee the reforms in the department. I formed police strategies with my partners in 2015, and for the last 7-8 years, we've been working with over 100 police departments in 8 states. In Minnesota, we're working with Richfield and Duluth, and our goal is to help law enforcement agencies collect, analyze, and report on their data. Most departments are sitting on mountains and mountains of data that's not accessible and certainly not usable in any format. That's basically what we do, is help them understand their data and then report it back to elected officials in the community. On a side note, just a personal note, I used to live in Minneapolis in the 1960s. My dad went to grad school at University of Minnesota and also worked at the Guthrie Theater, so I live near Lake of the Isles, so I have a personal connection to this area. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about to sort of set the stage, and by the way, I've sort of divided my presentation into 3 sections, and even though we're scheduled to go for 3 hours, it may go quicker than that. But the first section I wanted to talk about is basically the landscape of data analysis and reporting on racial disparities in policing, because it's not a localized phenomenon, right? This issue is going on across the country in every single department, and there's a lot of media attention on it, a lot of attention from different advocacy groups like the ACLU, so it's important to understand the full context before we get into the specific data for Richfield PD. So I was just in California before I came here, and I did 2 presentations for the California Chiefs Association, and one of the things that we talked about was their Racial Identity and Profiling Act. So the California legislature passed a law that said that every agency all 560 agencies in California must collect data on every single stop that they make, whether it's a pedestrian stop, a traffic stop, or a call for service. And so that's been going on for several years now, and the data has been, and they're spending literally probably more than $100 million on this data collection program with all the agencies, because it's a specialized data collection program. So there's a lot of effort going into collecting this data. And then it's being analyzed by a Ripa board and different advocacy groups and so forth. All the data is publicly available. And so what we were talking about is the use and misuse of this data. And what can we learn from this data, and then what are the limitations of the data? And so the goal of the Ripa Act was to eliminate racial and identity profiling. And so one of the things that the assumptions that went into the bill is that racial and identity profiling is widespread. And so they started the program with the belief that this is a common problem within law enforcement, and that somehow collecting this data is going to solve the problem. And it also has the goal of improving diversity and racial and identity sensitivity in law enforcement. And the challenge with a law like this is that the data won't do this, right? The data is not going to identify racial profiling, and the data is not going to improve diversity and racial and identity sensitivity. The data just doesn't do that. And so you're setting up expectations that you're going to really be able to understand what's going on and fix things simply by collecting data. And so a lot of my beginning of my presentation is talking about the limitations of data collection in this area. And as everyone knows, this is a big issue. And there's a lot of complexity involved, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what we can and we can't learn from the data. So I'm not here today to tell you one way or the other whether racial profiling or racial bias is a problem within Richfield PD. It's possible to see no racial disparities in the data and still have it be a problem either with individual officers or with the department. It's also possible to see disparities in the data and it not be a problem in the department because the disparities may be caused by other factors. So we have to really understand not only the disparities in the data, but the limitations on the data. One of the questions that I asked the police chiefs, so there were 2 meetings about 250 police chiefs and command staff in total, and one of the questions I asked was, does your agency condone or allow racial profiling or bias policing? And not a single police chief raised their hand, which is not surprising, because racial profiling and bias policing is illegal. It's unconstitutional. And most agencies will have a policy that tells their officers specifically, you cannot use race in any law enforcement decision unless it's part of a suspect description. And those agencies that have policies, if there's a complaint about racial profiling, they will investigate that complaint. And if that complaint is sustained, those officers will be disciplined in some way, including up into termination. And so, from the law enforcement perspective, there's no agency in the United States that's going to say that they condone this practice. So the next question is, to the chiefs is, do any of your officers engage in racial profiling or bias policing? And of course they say, well, you know, we hope they don't, but we can't guarantee that. And so the way that they find out, or the way that they hear about issues about profiling and bias policing, is through complaints. So if an agency is getting a lot of complaints about bias policing and racial profiling, then they're going to investigate those complaints, look at those officers, and make a determination as to whether or not there's a problem. There are very few racial profiling complaints in general. The more attention is brought to the issue, the more complaints we're seeing in recent years. We've seen complaints on this issue increase. The problem is that the sustained rate for complaints about bias policing and racial profiling is extremely low. Usually it's less than 1%. So less than 1% of complaints about bias policing are actually found to be sustained and the officer receives some kind of discipline. And the reason the sustained rate is so low, I think, is because what we're talking about with bias policing and racial profiling is what is going on in the officer's head. And how do you prove that an officer is biased? There is no officer that's going to put in their report, I stopped the driver because they were black. The officer's always going to have to put a legitimate reason for the stop. And so maybe it's a taillight out, maybe it's speeding. And so the driver who files a complaint may feel, well, you just stopped me because I'm black. And so the question is, well, if you receive a complaint, how do you know whether the officer was biased or not in that stop if they had a legitimate reason to stop? And they will always have a legitimate reason, otherwise the stop is unlawful. And so it's a challenge to, even with the complaint process, to determine if there is bias going on in policing. Now, obviously, we have some situations where officers, typically, what we see is on social media. Right? So you may have officers that make racial epithets or say racist things in their social media posts, and then they're discovered. And we've seen news reports from around the country. We're working with San Jose PD, and San Jose had that very situation, and several officers were dismissed because of those racist tweets and posts in their private Facebook group. So that's one way, obviously, to prove some kind of bias, even though that's not directly in the policing context. But these are very difficult cases to prove. And then my next question is, do you have any data, to the chiefs, do you have any data to support your answer? I mean, even though we're collecting a lot of data and looking at racial disparities, that data ultimately can't answer the question we want to answer, which is, are there individual officers or systemic practices in the department that are biased? So I'm going to give you a lot of data, and I'm not going to be able to answer those questions. I'm sorry. So one of the challenges with any data collection program looking at racial disparities or police bias is you have to make a lot of assumptions about the data. And one of the assumptions you have to make is that officers are always truthful when they fill out their forms and say what happened and the race of the person. Because we're saying, arguments are being made that these racial disparities are evidence of bias. And the data, 100% of the data comes from the officers. And not only does it come from the officers, but it comes from the officers' perception of race. If you look at your there's no driver's license in the United States that has race. Has your gender, has your date of birth, but your race is not on your driver's license. And most data collection programs do not require officers to ask the person what their race or ethnicity is. It's based on their perception. How do we know if an officer is giving an accurate perception of what the race of the person they stopped is? We don't. But in order to use the data to make conclusions about racial bias in policing, we have to assume that the officers are being 100% truthful. And the flip side is that if you have a racist officer who is simply pulling over a particular race because they're biased against them, it's very easy for that officer to defeat the system because it's based on their perception of race. And there's no way to verify whether their perception is accurate or not. So we have, again, the data collection program cannot be used to identify officers or bias practices in the department. And one of the reasons that I don't particularly like doing these kind of studies because there's not much we can tell from the data. I'd much rather get into use of force data collection and really dive deep into the data where we can learn something. But the reason that these kind of reports that we did for Richfield are so important is to provide an accurate picture of what's happening and to counteract the false narratives that are out there about disparities. And you will see over and over again in the media, oh, well, black people are 5 times more likely than white people to be stopped by the police, therefore there's bias. And so it's important to understand what those numbers mean and what they don't mean. You also have to assume that again, officers are accurately perceiving race and gender identity in every single stop. So that because most, and we'll talk about the benchmarking, most racial disparity studies use population as a benchmark. Now, there are many problems that we'll talk about with population, but one of the problems is that census data is self-reported race and ethnicity. So you're comparing an officer's perception of someone's race with how they self-report their own race and ethnicity. So no one knows how often an officer accurately reports someone's race. And what do you do with mixed race people? I mean, and also another problem with census data is that census data reports, when you report your census data, you report race and ethnicity separately. In most data collection programs, race and ethnicity are merged into one. So in the census, you can be black Hispanic, white Hispanic, Native American Hispanic, but in most data collection programs, ethnicity is moved into race, so you can only be Hispanic and not another race. So another problem with using population as a benchmark. Another problem with using population is that you have to assume that everyone in your population, in your local population, regardless of their age, race, and gender, commits crimes at the same rate and are equally likely of being stopped and arrested by the police. And obviously that's an unrealistic assumption, but you have to do it if you're going to use population as a benchmark. So that means that a child in nursery school is just as likely to be stopped by the police for speeding as a senior citizen in a nursing home as a 21-year-old guy, because you're using population as the benchmark. And so that includes everybody in your community, not just the people who are out there committing crimes or violating traffic laws. And that's obviously not a realistic assumption, but that's built into the population benchmarks. You also have to assume that officers are deployed randomly around the city and stop every violation that they see. And we know that's not true in any jurisdiction, because police deployment is going to be based on calls for service. If you're living in a neighborhood where there's no crime and no calls for service, you're not going to get many police officers patrolling the streets. As if you're in a retail core with lots of calls for service, lots of shoplifting and other activities, you're going to have a much greater police presence. So you're much more likely to be stopped by the police in a high crime area than a low crime area. But If we use population as a benchmark, we assume that every area of your city is treated equally by the police. The other thing we have to assume is that police officers actually have the time to racially profile. So one assumption that's built into the data by many people that look at this is that the disparities for groups, particularly for African American groups, are driven by officers who are only stopping these individuals because of their race. And when you talk to any police officer, they're running from call to call. They're dealing with a lot of serious crimes and a lot of draws on their attention and time. And to the extent that we do have, and I'm not denying that there's racial profiling, I'm sure there is going on, but there's not a lot of time for officers to engage in this activity. And the other assumption that is made often with these racial disparity studies is that any disparity between a police activity where there are stops, arrests, uses of force, and the population, any disparity is due to racial bias, nothing else. And what we'll look at is there are racial disparities throughout our society. And there's discrimination throughout our society. And so if you look at virtually any metric, if you look at poverty, if you look at homelessness, if you look at housing, you look at education, you look at healthcare, you're going to find racial disparities. And some of those factors are going to drive criminal behavior. So if you're poor, unemployed, homeless, your chances of engaging in some kind of unlawful activity are much higher than if you have housing, a good job, and a high income. And so these disparities in our society are driving a lot of the disparities that we see in policing. Now, that's not saying that there's not racial profiling going on or biased policing going on, but there's a lot more going on than just that. And we can't tease it out from the data alone. I can't tell you, well, 10% of this disparity is due to police bias and 90% for other things. But we do know that there are other factors involved. Now, the Ripa data, and I'm going to show you Ripa data in a moment. The Ripa data assumes that the Ripa data, all the analysis done of Ripa involves population benchmarks. So the population of a city, the population of a county, or the population of a state. And the assumption is that any overrepresentation in stops is evidence of racial bias by police. But they don't address what if there's no disparity, or what if there's underrepresentation. That's never addressed. Only the overrepresentation is addressed. But if you say that overrepresentation is evidence of bias, we also see underrepresentation in the data as well. So if you look at the Asian population and Asian stops in virtually any jurisdiction in the country, you will see that Asians are underrepresented in the data for policing. So if we say that overrepresentation means bias against a particular group, then you would have to also say that underrepresentation of Asians mean that police are giving Asians a break. And they're not stopping them and they're not arresting them when they could. And nobody's going to say that, right? It doesn't make any sense. Nobody's going to say that police would do that. There's no reason for them to do that. But we can't have one assumption without the other. So two key concepts here before we talk about the data is that correlation does not mean causation. So there are a lot of correlations in the data. And one correlation that we see, particularly when we look at population as a benchmark, we see that black individuals are generally overrepresented in policing data, in reported crimes, in victims of crimes, in stops, in arrests, in searches, and uses of force. There's no question there's overrepresentation of black individuals. But what the data cannot tell us is what the cause of that correlation is. I can't look at the numbers and tell you if that's due to bias or other factors. There's no one that can. But that assumption is often made. Oh, there's a correlation here, there's a disparity here, therefore, this must be the reason. And the other thing is that racial disparity does not equate with racial bias. You can have disparities and no bias, and you can have no disparities and you can have bias. Now, if you have extreme disparities using a valid benchmark, you can definitely say that that's evidence of potential systemic bias. And the absence of disparities with a good benchmark can be evidence of a lack of bias, but you can't say that definitively, especially for small disparities. There are many, many reasons why those might occur. So first of all, I wanted to go through the Ripa data, because this is what people are used to seeing and used to talking about in the media and with different groups. And so on the Ripa data, and this is from their most recent report, so the data goes to what's called a Ripa board. It's made up of different community groups and police groups, and they look at the data and they produce a report. And so for search rates, so this is search after a stop, we see that black individuals are much more likely to be stopped, more than twice as likely than white individuals or any other racial group. And we hear this a lot, that black people are more likely to be searched than other racial groups. And absolutely, I'm not denying that data. That is accurate. This is accurate data. So the question is why? Why is there this disparity? Is it because police are biased against black people, or are there other factors going on that are causing that disparity? Similarly, we look at use of force rates. For black individuals, again, more than twice as likely as white individuals, after they've been stopped, to have force used against them. Now, we've been working with Richfield PD for a number of years on their use of force data, and we extract up to 150 different data variables from each of their use of force incident reports, and we're able to go far beyond the simple quantitative look. So we look at the reason, why did the officer use force, and what was the subject behavior? So we look at the level of resistance, the level of crime involved, the level of threat, whether the suspect fled. And so you can understand, why did the officer use force? And if there are any disparities, we can look at that data to determine why those disparities exist. But with this data, you don't know, just from looking at these numbers, because all you have is, was force used or not, yes or no? And so, but I can tell you from the research that we've done with all of our jurisdictions, is that what drives force, what drives an officer to use force, because officers can only use force lawfully if it's justified. And they can't use excessive force. So if the rates are higher, it's more likely that the group that has the highest use of force rates are more likely to flee, more likely to resist, more likely to threaten the officer, and are involved in more serious crimes. So we can't just look at officer behavior when we're looking at disparities. We have to look at subject behavior, and we have to compare the two. Now, if this was data on individuals that had the same levels of resistance, then I would say, oh, well, that's concerning. That 2.1% is concerning, because basically the subjects are all doing the same thing, and yet the police are using force more often against black individuals than other racial groups. That could be a problem. But that's not what we have here. And then the result of the stop, what they pointed out were the racial disparities for stops that resulted in no action. So there was no ticket, there was no arrest, and no contraband was recovered. And so the argument is that because blacks are stopped more often with no action taken, that means that the stop was illegitimate, and there was no basis for the stop. Now, the problem with that argument is that it doesn't take into consideration that the officer may be giving a person a break. They may be deciding not to give them a citation. And so we don't know just from this number why that is. We just know that this disparity is here, but you have to dig deeper to figure out, well, why is it? Why is it that officers are stopping people and not taking action more often with blacks than other groups? And the data doesn't tell us that. The Ripa data goes way beyond looking at disparities by race. So they're also looking at gender identity. And one of the things that they look at is transgender man, boy, transgender woman, girl. Now again, perception. This is the officer's perception. Nobody's asking the driver or the person they stop, what is your gender orientation? So all this data is based on what the officer perceives. And these are extremely small numbers. The transgender man, boy, the transgender woman, girl are less than 0.2%, I think, of all the data. But there are disparities. And so reasonable suspicion is when you have a suspicion of criminal activity versus traffic violation versus other. And obviously for transgender man, boy, and transgender woman, girl, the percentage of reasonable suspicion is greater than for other gender groups. Now, one of the arguments that is made by the Ripa board and others is that this is evidence of a bias against transgender. And the reason is that they're stopping these groups more often for reasonable suspicion than traffic stops. And that's certainly one plausible explanation, is that officers are biased against this group. But there are other possible explanations, and when you dig deeper into the data, I mean, number one, you're talking about very small numbers for this group, but number two, you see that the reasonable suspicion, a lot of it has to do with prostitution and human trafficking. And so there may be differences, behavioral differences in the people that they're contacting that drive certain disparities in the data. And you have to understand the underlying information before you can understand the data. And you can't make these quick assumptions that, oh, this means they're biased against these two groups. It may be true, but you need more information before you can reach that conclusion.
Do you have that information?
Pardon me?
Do you have that information?
Do I have that information?
Yeah.
No.
Why not?
They don't collect it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is data that's required legislatively. So they had several committees get together and decide there's a 4-page RIPA form that police officers are required to fill out. And the individuals that designed the form were not data scientists, right? So the data is very poorly organized, so it's hard to analyze. There are few tweaks that could be made, and one of my suggestions was to add a few questions that police officers or police departments could add to the form, which would greatly enhance the usability of the data. And I'll get into one of those questions in a moment. Another thing they wanted to look at was mental health and other disabilities. And so what they found, and again, this is officers' perception of someone's mental health or disability. So what they found was that for search rates, those that were identified as having a mental health disability had 55% of those individuals that were contacted were searched, versus only 11% for no disability and 31% for other types of physical disabilities or developmental disabilities. So one way to read this is, well, and one of the conclusions that they reach, the Ripa board reaches, is that there's bias. There's bias here. And for whatever reason, officers are searching people with mental health disabilities at a much higher rate than other groups. That's certainly one plausible explanation. But there's another explanation, which is that California has a code called 5150. I understand, but I'm sure that, and I'll ask the chief, do you have situations where someone is involuntarily committed for mental health reasons?
Yes, we do.
And is that like a code, or is that a?
Yeah, it's based upon the Minnesota state statutes where somebody can be involuntarily committed.
Right. So to my knowledge, every state has a law that allows individuals to be involuntarily committed for mental health purposes. So it might be a 72-hour evaluation or some type of evaluation. And if the person doesn't want to go to the hospital, then the police will be called. And if the person refuses to get in the ambulance or get on the gurney, and they need to be, under the law, involuntarily committed, then some level of force is going to be used. And whenever an officer uses force or takes somebody into custody, even if it's not an arrest, they will be searched. Because if you're using force and you're putting somebody on a gurney, you need to make sure there are no weapons or needles or anything else. So they will be searched. And those searches will be recorded in the Ripa data. So I don't know for sure, because the data is not collected, but when I present this to California law enforcement, this would be my guess as well, as to why the search rate is so much higher, because a very high percentage of people with mental health issues they're contacting are not involved in criminal behavior, but they're being involuntarily committed.
So is this data from California or is this data from Richfield?
It's from California.
Why are we talking about California?
Well, I'm talking about this data explains how the traditional way of looking at use of racial disparity data. I will get into the Richfield data for sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. We will get to the Richfield data in great detail.
So we're going to have a question and answer after the presentation. Bob's going to get to the Richfield data in just a bit, so I'd ask that you be patient.
I'm just trying to understand the concept.
No,
here.
I'm sorry. We're going to do question and answer after the presentation.
Well, it'd also be easier to get through the material, but I will answer all your questions, I promise. And here's another thing to look at here are the discovery rates. And we see that the discovery rates, and this is for weapons, contraband, that kind of thing, are lowest for people that are searched that have mental health disabilities. And that's not surprising either, because they're not being searched because they're being arrested for a crime. They're being searched because they're being involuntarily committed, so very few of them have weapons or contraband on them. And the other reason, just to go back to the question, the other reason that I'm presenting this data is that you will see, I've read countless racial disparity studies. The data is the same. There are minor variations between departments, but you will see, if you had all this data from Richfield, you would see similar patterns. And we can also look at people with disability who are searched, curbside, patrol car detention, handcuffed, again, much higher than those without disability, primarily driven by these mental health involuntary commitments. And use of force rates as well. Much higher for people with disabilities than no disabilities, again, because they're refusing to get in the gurney and get in the ambulance to go to the hospital. Now, I want to talk about, again, we're talking about the methodology now and how this kind of data is being analyzed, law enforcement data. And one of the most common tests that are used are a veil of darkness test. And it looks at, the theory is that if racial profiling is going on, it's more likely to occur during the day than at night. Because in the day, you should be able to see the race of the driver, and at night, you don't. So we would expect the racial disparities to be higher during the day than at night. And so when the Ripa data was looked at, and the assumption is that the officers can always see the race of the driver during the day and can never see it at night, but it also assumes that the driving behavior during the day is the same as the driving behavior at night. And the data shows that that's not even close. I mean, during rush hour, you have a completely different population on the road that you have at 2 a.m. when the bars get out. But you have to make all these assumptions in the data. And with the Ripa data, one of the reasons I'm presenting this is because I'll show you a video from the ACLU, because they're absolutely convinced that the Ripa data shows that there's widespread bias. But the veil of darkness test shows the opposite, and that at 0, 1, and 2 in the morning, that's when it's actually at night that you have the highest disparities for black individuals, and during the day you have the lowest disparities. And for whites, you have the highest number of whites stopped during the day and the lowest at night. Excuse me, gotta get some water. So there's a Public Policy Institute of California that did a study of this data, and these are the results they came up with. So instead of accepting the results and saying, oh, well, this doesn't support our theory of racial bias, what they did was they came up with a new test. And they said, well, we'll use the daylight savings time test, and we'll look at 1 week during the year when daylight savings time changes, and then as we go from light to dark, we would expect lower racial disparities, and dark to light, higher racial disparities. And so they said, well, we'll ignore the veil of darkness test, and we'll go with this other test that nobody has ever used before. And so this is what I mean about you've got to be really careful when you're looking at the data, because a lot of people have opinions about what the data means. And it doesn't always mean what they say it means. So as we're talking about the key questions to ask with a racial disparity study, you have to ask the question of officers, were you able to see the race of the driver before you stopped them? Because if they can't see the race of the driver, then those disparities can't be based on bias. And so Pleasanton, California, they asked this extra question of officers. And 91% of the time, the officers said they could not see the race of the driver before the stop. Now, some people would say, well, we can't believe the officers, right? We can't trust the officers to say that, to be truthful. But then you can't trust anything, right? You can't trust the racial disparity data because that's all coming from the officers. And why would they be truthful here and not truthful there? So this is a huge, this basically renders all of the Ripa data meaningless in terms of racial disparities and racial bias. Because those disparities cannot be based on racial bias if the officers can't identify the race of the person before they stop them. So that's why these key questions are essential to understand the data. And not only that, what we found in the Pleasanton data is that when race was perceived, white people were more likely to be stopped than people of color. And when the officer couldn't see the race of the person, that's when people of color were more likely to be stopped than white people. This is the opposite of what you would expect to see if there was racial bias going on. Now, yes? Okay. Okay. So the Ripa data has been used a lot, and I know that there are, certainly with Minneapolis, there's been a lot of reports on using their data and on racial bias. And the media, the media will always use population as a benchmark. And you will always get these large disparities. And the assumption is that the disparities are always caused by police bias. And so that's one of the reasons I'm going through this, is to let me go through this here, is to show you that there are many different ways of looking at the data and interpreting the data, and you need to question how the data is being analyzed. And I want to show you this study that was done by a Harvard professor, economics professor. Sorry. A Harvard economics professor. And he'd never studied policing data before, but he was very interested in it. And so what he did was he did several studies. And the first study he did was on stop data in New York City. And so he did a deep dive into the data. He didn't use population as a benchmark. And what he looked at was he looked at use of force during the stop and frisk. And what he found was that black individuals were much more likely than white individuals to have force used against them in all these different ways, in every different sort of force tactic. And so he published this study, and it was also in the New York Times. He got a lot of attention for it, and no criticism. And then he did another study. And he did a study in Houston, Texas. And what he looked at was, and again, not using population as a benchmark, he had a very thorough methodology for analyzing this data. And what he found, he looked at the use of deadly force by Houston PD. And what he found was that black individuals were less likely than white individuals to have deadly force used against them by Houston PD officers. And he was criticized severely for this study. Same methodology that he used in New York. And you can find this, there's plenty of news articles about him. And what I'd like to do is to play a video, Professor Roland Fryer, who did both of these studies, talking about how these studies were received by the public, and talking about his methodology and how he goes about analyzing data. Can we play that video?
Area where you went out and tried to take on this narrative that black men in particular are over-policed, that there's excessive force being used, and you found, well, why don't you describe the arc of some of the things that you found, how that mirrors or not the dominant narrative, and whether or not actually having the accurate data has changed the narrative or not.
Absolutely, love it. And let me just back up 1 second, which is, when I go into a question like this, when it comes to police use of force or education, what have you, I go in with my personal views, normally, inspired by my grandmother. But I let the data talk, and I don't care what it says.
Yep.
Okay? So, and I go into it thinking, this is going to help black folks. Every single time. So when people look at my work and they say, oh, but he didn't find what I wanted him to find, that work is the difference between me and folks like that is that I'm willing to tell the truth. I don't care the personal cost. Let me be very clear about that. So I believe that literally the truth will set us free. And so sometimes it might be inconvenient. Like my grandmother told me the truth all the time too. I didn't want to hear it sometimes, and sometimes it was wonderful to hear, but it was always the truth. And so I just want to be clear about that before we even get into this, that, my motivation is I am trying to make life happier, better, fairer, et cetera, for black folks. But I am absolutely tied to the data. Okay? I will not go away from it. Police use of force. I think it was Walter Scott that got me. I had seen the footage that everybody else had seen.
Yep.
And I just kind of was like, geez, wait, what do you got?
Just remind everyone the Walter.
Yeah, Walter Scott, it's amazing that we have to. Okay, but Walter Scott in South Carolina, running across this patchy, seedy field, is gunned down by a police officer, shot, 10, 12 times. I don't remember the number. Because he was pulled over for a broken taillight and just got out and ran. Okay. I have been roughed up by the police. Many black people I know have been roughed up by the police. I didn't know what the data were going to find, but for me, it was enough was enough. I said, someone has to get to the bottom of this question, right? I didn't know how. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I just knew I had to get to the bottom. And so went and talked to a colleague of mine and said, I got to approach this. And he said, you crazy? And I said, well, let me understand it. What you're telling me is you are more concerned about your own career than the well-being of the black folks that we could help if we actually can change police policy. And the person basically said, you betcha. Okay? So I decided to embed myself in some police departments because I said, look, I don't like the police that much. And I don't even know where to find data. I don't know what the data look like. So through some personal connections, I did some ride-alongs in Camden and in Houston.
Wow.
And other places, okay? And, you know, it was the best education I got since Miss O'Neill taught me to read in first grade. Man, this job is complicated, you know, and I'm not proud of how you feel when you're riding around in a police car because you feel like just the way, the whole vibe of the job, the patrol is, everyone's just on edge. With your presence, you're on edge with their presence, and you know, if you ride around looking for bad guys for 8 hours, I'd say about hour 6, even if you're a civilian, you start looking at everybody as a bad guy. It's a weird job, man. But anyway, we collected tons and tons of data. In Houston, we were able to collect data, and it was hard, man. We had to get innovative, right? Because they won't give it to you. So we had to go in places like Houston and set up shop and pay a sergeant $50 an hour to watch us type in the data manually.
Wow.
So we went to great lengths to find this data, and what we did was we had 10 cities with data on officer-involved shootings. We had Houston, where we had not only officer-involved shootings, we had other levels of force. We had all the taser shootings. We had a very rich data set. And then we also had 2 data sets, one from New York that had 5 million observations on lower-level uses of force. And so we had, at the end, across all data sets, we had data that was, you know, used force as light as, you know, an argument between civilian and police all the way up to fatal shooting. Okay? And the data shocked me. I've said that before. I'll just give a summary now. You dig in with your question. On lower level uses of force, we found pretty large racial differences in lower level uses of force. Okay? So on any random stop, black people are 50% more likely to have force used on them than white people. Okay? Now you're going to say, hey, Roland, the stops are different, the places are different. I'm with you, brother. I got all that. Right? So, but as you increase the things that you can account for, when you get to the end, I can take people who got stopped on the same block at the same time of day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're still 15% more likely to have force used on them. If I look at, this is the most striking to me, people who the police themselves say are compliant. Hey, this person they were compliant. 20% difference still in use of force by race. Okay? Now, folks have come after me. How could you be so dumb to use police data, right? Listen, even the police said they were compliant. So right? This is more in the favor of that argument. Even then, there was a racial difference. Okay? Now, on the second piece, officer-involved shooting, yes, there is a racial difference when you look at population proportion. In other words, black people are 50% of the shootings, whether or not they're fatal, and whatever 12% of the population. That's not a statistic that an economist would find interesting, but I've heard that said. But when you actually start to compare apples with the shootings data, you get no racial difference in shootings. Okay. I'm going to pause there because that's the first part people like.
Right.
Second part, they don't.
Well, some people like it.
Some people don't. I was as surprised as everyone else about the second part, but I'm going to report the data. Let me tell you about it. I gave this paper early on at a law school. 3 professors took me to the side. You know, this never happened in my career. I've been doing this 20 years. Say, hey, I want you to publish that first part. And that second part is just so different, Roland. It's so different. You don't want to publish it. You put that away for them. I said, let me ask a question. It's just us. Let me ask a question. If the second part showed racial differences, would you put it in with the first part? And they said, yeah, then we put it in with the first part. I said, well, you just guaranteed I'm going to put it in no matter what.
But your premise The reason you started doing this research was that you had a belief. And we were having all these conversations, Hannity and Combs, blah, blah, all these people talking without data. The central ingredient needs to be data, because I believe this too. I mean, in my own work, I try to talk about data all the time in education. And yet here you are in a rigorous study, and the initial desire is to suppress the component of your research that conflicts with the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Why is that happening? Why is that happening? And what can we do to change it so that that data is accepted for the data that it is, for the truth that it is?
We can have, I don't know, you asked a very important question, and I don't know the answer to that, but let me just tell you what I would like for me. I will literally come to your house this evening and sit up with you and argue all night about the data. But when you question my motives because you don't like the answer, I won't talk to you for 2 minutes. And so I think part of the issue is folks see data they don't like, and they impede the motives of the person, of the author of the study, rather than digging in and saying, well, you don't understand selection bias, right? Like, that's a different argument. Okay? I think we'd have a lot more people working in this area if the first thing you thought was, oh, well, they're idiot economists. They don't know how to do data. That's a different question. But when you go at someone's integrity because you don't like the findings, then of course not. Look, man, I mean, students are being told all across the country, don't touch these issues. It would be so against my own identity to not keep pushing these issues, right? Like, and again, it's not like I wanted this outcome. I didn't go, ooh, it must be great to be controversial. People say, you're controversial. I'm like, it's not controversial. I'm just following the data wherever it leads. What are you doing? And this has happened on both sides, right? Like, sometimes I have conclusions that conservatives don't like. Sometimes I have conclusions that, I don't care about that stuff, Ian. I really don't. I mean, I find it frustrating. I find it insulting that people would change the truth because they think they're trying to help us.
Yeah.
They're just trying to help themselves. Let's be clear.
So I don't put myself nearly at the same level as Professor Fryer, but I like to think that my motivations are the same as his. What I'm trying to do is to show people what we can learn from the data, but also what we can't learn from the data. And to hopefully help prevent the misuse of data to reach erroneous conclusions that may lead to bad policies, or bad practices. So we want to all be on the same page, right? We want to have a common understanding of the data, but also the limitations of that data. And one of the things that I don't know if you caught it, but that Professor Fryer said was that some people look at the data compared to the population, but that's not a statistic that an economist would be interested in. He knows how to analyze data. He's an economist. He's not good. He doesn't have a lot of experience with policing data, but he knows how to analyze data, no matter what the topic. And it's the key point. If you take away nothing else from this presentation, we can't draw any definitive conclusions by comparing policing data with the population, which is what most media outlets and studies do. So I'm going to go for another 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a break and questions after that. I wanted to talk about, and again, the second half will be all about Richfield data. I want to talk about racial disparities in the criminal justice system, and sort of looking at, forgetting about the data for a moment, is there a way that we can reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system? And I would say yes, there is. And we'll talk about some of those. But there are some folks that say, well, let's have officers not do traffic stops, right? Don't worry about equipment violations, expired tabs, and that's certainly an option, right? And we'll go through what the impacts of that would be. But I mean, we have traffic laws for a reason, right? So we have traffic safety. We have licensing compliance, both for the driver and the vehicle. We have insurance and liability. And it's also a revenue generator for some jurisdictions. And then why do we have police departments, right? There's a whole defund the police movement, right, that may have started in Minneapolis. But the question is, well, okay, we could defund the police. That's certainly an option. But why do we have police in the first place? And is that a viable option? And obviously we need police to enforce the laws that are passed by your state legislature. And they also respond to calls for service. Chief, I don't know, like offhand, how many calls for service do you get every year?
40,000.
So 40,000. So 40,000 calls for service for police services every year from the community. If the police weren't there, who's going to respond to those calls? And the role of officers. Well, officers are there to arrest people, right? That's their job. And so if an individual commits a crime and they are caught and there's probable cause, their job is to arrest them. That's what they're hired to do. And look at my second point there. How about that? Protect and assist victims of crime. That's obviously one of the things that they're designed to do, right? That's why we want them, to protect the community. But one of the ways that they do that is to arrest criminal suspects and ensure public safety and quality of life, right? You want to live in a safe community, right? And that's the job of police officers, is to keep the community safe. So how could we reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system? Well, one way is to do selective enforcement. And I did a presentation up in Duluth, and there was a group that also did a racial disparity study. They came up with different results because they used different benchmarks than we used. But their conclusion in their report was that by the end of this year, they wanted all of the police statistics, stops, arrests, uses of force, to match the demographics of the population. That was their charge to the police department. The only way that the police department could do that would be illegal, because they would have to implement a quota system and say you can only pull over a certain number of people of different demographic groups that match the population, and they would have to ignore crimes that didn't meet the quota and look for crimes to meet their quota, right? Nobody's going to advocate for that. But that is what this group said they wanted the police department to do, is to have their statistics match the population, because there were racial disparities. And another thing we could do, which, there's so much focus on the police with racial disparities, when the focus should really be on the legislature. Because the legislature passes the laws that the police are required to enforce. So if you don't want the police to stop individuals for equipment violations, then those laws should be repealed. And then the police wouldn't be able to do that. Right? If your legislature's making something criminal that results in racial disparities, and you don't like those racial disparities, then the solution is not to tell the police to stop enforcing the law, is to tell the legislature to repeal the laws that you don't want. Another thing is to reduce criminal behavior. So much of the focus is on the police and racial disparities. But the police are responding to calls for service and criminal activity that they observe. So if you want to reduce racial disparities, the most effective in policing, the most effective way is to invest in those underserved communities where criminal behavior occurs most frequently. That would reduce racial disparities in policing, guaranteed. And selective enforcement is something that all sort of regulatory agencies have, whether it's police, prosecutors, or regulators. There's way more violations of the law that occur, that are observed, than can be enforced, right? Our jails would be overflowing. Well, they already are overflowing, but even more overflowing if the police actually enforced every violation that they saw. So every day, police officers are having to make decisions about what to enforce and what not to enforce. They can't enforce everything. So what happens is you have a prioritization, right? So violent felonies are going to be priority one. Equipment violations are probably on the lower end of the priority, right? No police department's going to put equipment violations at the top. But they have that discretion. There's a lot of discretion in the criminal justice system, a lot, whether it's police, prosecutors, judges. That discretion is where bias can play a role. And that's what we need to focus on, are these high discretion areas. And so one of the things that happened in Seattle before we legalized marijuana is the police chief said, look, I've got way more calls than we can deal with. Marijuana is still illegal, but I'm going to instruct my officers that it's the lowest priority in the department. You can still enforce it, but it has to be an extreme example, right? And that reduced racial disparities. You also have plea bargaining. Prosecutors can plea bargain at cases down from felonies to misdemeanors. Happens all the time. That's selective enforcement. You might have whatever the problems are in your community. Maybe you have DUI, a lot of DUI problems, right? Then the department will respond by doing DUI emphasis patrols, and they will focus on drivers at a particular time or a particular area. That's selective enforcement. You might have gang problems and create a gang task force to focus on those issues. Racial profiling or racial quotas, that is selective enforcement. The difference is that all the ones above are legal. That's not legal, but it's the same concept, right? You're selectively enforcing the law. The question is, are you doing it lawfully? And all of these things will affect racial disparities. I wrote an op-ed in the Seattle Times that you can find, and basically, because not surprisingly in Seattle and every other jurisdiction, racial disparities, racial profiling and policing are a big issue. And one of the things the reason I wrote the op-ed was that the Washington Supreme Court issued a ruling that said officers must consider race in every activity that they do. And if the person is a person of color that they're dealing with, they have to be treated differently than a white person. And that's the law now in Washington. So I think that is discriminatory and unconstitutional under the US Constitution. So I wrote an op-ed about it, and I said, look, the goal here is to reduce racial disparities. And the Washington Supreme Court thinks that this ruling is going to reduce racial disparities. I don't think it's going to have that impact. And so what I said was, if you really want to get at racial disparities, before you consider defunding the police or restricting their activities, you've got to invest in underserved communities that are generating the criminal behavior and calls for service that the police are responding to. And if you don't do that, there's nothing the police can do to reduce those racial disparities. Legally, nothing. And I put a lot of data in this op-ed, and one of the things I looked at were all the racial disparities in Washington state that had nothing to do with policing. And one of the disparities is that black household median income in Seattle is 5% of white household net median income. That's a huge disparity. And I have no doubt that income and wealth, that is going to impact criminal behavior. If you have no resources, if you have no home, you have no net worth, and you're trying to survive and feed your family, right? You're more likely than a wealthy person to engage in criminal activity, and you're more likely to come into contact with police and get arrested and be put in jail. So we've got to address
Where's the data for that? That's a big assumption.
that this data here.
No, you just said. Poor people are going to commit more crimes than rich people.
And well, let me preface that. Poor people are more likely to commit crimes than rich people and get caught by the police. There's a lot of crime on Wall Street, right? A lot of crime on Wall Street that is not being reported and is not being investigated. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for correcting me.
Can I correct you too?
At the break, you can correct me. Okay. One of the things that's a hot topic now is let's get the police out of minor traffic enforcement. And some, like the Mecklenburg sheriff in North Carolina, they did this, and this is a news story about this. And so what they said in Mecklenburg was, okay, we're not going to stop anyone for a non-moving violation. Only serious moving violations. And I can tell you, even without seeing their data, I can tell you what's going to happen.
How can you tell us what's going to happen without seeing their data?
Because I've seen it in every jurisdiction that I've looked at. And I've looked at hundreds of jurisdictions, both our own studies and other studies. And the data is always the same. Always. The greatest racial disparities are for the most serious crimes. So if you're looking at violent felonies, every jurisdiction, you're going to have the greatest disparities by race. The lowest racial disparities are for minor traffic offenses. You still have racial disparities. They're still there. But they're much, much smaller than violent crimes. So if you focus, if you take out these incidents with low racial disparities and you focus on incidents with high racial disparities, the overall racial disparities will increase.
But can you agree that sometimes those racial disparities result in life-ending decisions made by cops in a split second, including a guy sitting right back there who murdered someone?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no police encounter that has no risk, right? Every single encounter that a police officer has a risk to the officer and a risk to the person being stopped. Every single one.
How were in those situations?
What?
The person or the officer?
Well,
They don't care. Who cares? It's important.
let me finish my presentation, then we'll get into it, because I'll get off track. But we'll have time for a discussion. I'll be happy to engage in a dialogue and answer your questions.
I would really like to get to the Richfield data. So Bob, I'd really like you to go through this quickly.
Okay, let me do.
And we're going to take a break. Bob's going to finish up. We're going to get to the Richfield data. You can ask your questions, write them down. If you continue to interrupt, then we're just going to film this and we're going to put it on the website. So please, you can talk to Bob during the break, but let's be respectful. We got a lot of different variety of opinions here, and I want Bob to be able to get through his presentation, and especially to get to the Richfield data.
And just so you know, I enjoy debate discussion. I want to. Good. But last night when I did it for the presentation for the City Council, there were a lot of questions during the presentation I didn't finish. So I want to finish, and I also want to discuss. So one thing I want to talk about is an actual program that we implemented in Seattle in 2000 that dramatically reduced racial disparities in the jail. And it had to do with driving while license suspended in the third degree. I'm assuming, Chief, that you have a similar law here, right? So people don't pay their traffic tickets and they continue to drive after they get a suspended license. Extremely common crime, very low-level crime, right? It's basically an economic crime. You don't pay your tickets, you drive, you're committing a misdemeanor. What we found is that driving while license suspended made up 33% of all our jail bookings, 33%, for just driving with a suspended license. 46% of driving while license suspended arrests were black drivers, but they made up only 8% of the population. Huge disparity. High recidivism rates. So these individuals driving with a suspended license, spending a night in jail was just the cost of driving with a suspended license. There was no deterrent effect whatsoever in criminalizing this behavior. So what do? The City Council passed legislation based on data, and we created an impound program. And the motto was, you jail the car, not the driver. And what we found in the data when we did this was that a large number of suspended drivers who were driving vehicles were not driving their own vehicle. They were driving somebody else's vehicle. And so what we found is that when we started impounding the cars, the owners of those cars didn't like it because they had to pay money to get their car out. And what we found is that all of a sudden people weren't loaning their cars to suspended drivers as much. So the recidivism rate went way down because these suspended drivers couldn't find a car to drive easily. And then we had relicensing clinics, right? We wanted people to get relicensed. So we had all these relicensing clinics before the program started, and nobody showed up. And as soon as we did the impound program, these programs were full. So anybody that needed help to get relicensed, time payment plans, et cetera, could go to these relicensing clinics. All of a sudden, they were overflowing. And the municipal court, we tried to make it as easy as possible for people to get relicensed. And they had, the court implemented time payment plans. We had a car recovery clinic. We hired public defenders to challenge the city on the tow to get people's car back. So we had to make sure that we did everything perfectly, the police did everything perfectly in order for that tow to occur. The results were, within 1 year, we reduced jail bookings by 25%. We reduced racial disparities in the jail by 50% in 1 year. And after 1 year, the legislation was repealed. Because the same people that complained about racial disparities in the jail were now complaining about racial disparities in the impound. And they said it was inhumane to take cars away from poor people. So the program was working, we were reducing recidivism, we were reducing disparities in the jail, and yet the same critics convinced the council 5-4 to repeal the ordinance. So what happened? Went back to high disparities in the jail, more people being arrested, put in jail. I'll get to your thing. Oh, actually, we're done. I'm ready to talk about Richfield data now.
Why don't we take a break, and we have questions if you didn't get them at the front table. Our staff is here to collect those questions, and hopefully we will get to as many as we can tonight. Obviously, we want to answer everybody's questions. Those questions that we don't get to, you will definitely get an answer from our staff, and we'll do an FAQ sometime in the next week to post those questions and also the answers. So we'll take about a 10-minute break.